All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dean Knight, and I'm in charge of programs and tours here at the Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia. I am here at the museum today, and I am joined virtually by Scott Peeples, who is an English professor at the College of Charleston and a member of the Poe Museum's Board of Trustees. Scott's previous books include The Afterlife of Edgar Allan Poe and Edgar Allan Poe Revisited, and he's here with me today to discuss his latest book, The Man in the Crowd, Edgar Allan Poe and the City. And here it is. So welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for joining me today. Can we start
Great
with
to be
you?
here.
Oh, absolutely. Can we start with you telling us a little bit about the genesis of this book, how it came about?
Well, it's got kind of a long history. I'll try not to give too much unnecessary detail, but I started thinking about this project back in 2009, the Poe bicentennial,
Mhm.
and I was invited to give a talk by Paul Lewis at Boston College. They were doing a program. They were doing a Poe program, and it was sort of in the early days of his efforts to get Boston sort of back on the map with Poe sites.
Sure.
And so that event really got me started thinking about Poe and place and the way that different cities commemorate Poe, and also Poe's own experiences in these cities, and kind of I felt like it was just something that had not gotten enough attention. Each individual city, like Richmond and Baltimore and Philadelphia, will enshrine Poe in their own way. But I thought that a kind of overview of all of those places could really provide a nice focus for a biography. And so it really, I mean, that wasn't like, it didn't like come fully formed to me back in 2009. I kept sort of just going back to the idea of Poe and place, and wrote a couple of articles, couple of conference presentations on different places where Poe lived, and started to visit all of the sites. And just generally, I mean, it took about a decade for everything to come together. I will say one key moment was when I met with Michelle Van Paris about doing a book that would involve photographs. She's a friend of mine, photographer at the College of Charleston, and I just wanted to kind of pick her brain a little bit about the possibility of doing this kind of book, and she was enthusiastic about being involved in it, and so we collaborated on it ever since. And so she was a tremendous help from that point on.
Now, I was going to ask you about that, about how that collaboration came about, and also just sort of the logistics of it. Did the two of you travel together to the various cities, or was it working more independently? Or
We did travel together to Richmond and Baltimore, and and also Charlottesville and Petersburg, because at one point we were thinking of a book that would be a more comprehensive travel log of Poe sites. And it ended up being really focused on the four cities. And so, she's got a lot of great photographs of places that, really don't get emphasized in the book, I'll just say. But we did a road trip to mainly Richmond and Baltimore, and traveled on our own really to New York and Philadelphia. I had already spent enough time in those places to kind of know what I wanted to do, and sort of done the archival work that I needed. So she made her own trips up there.
yeah, there's some great shots of those places that I think we will be able to insert later on, but are really striking shots, including a few, obviously in the wintertime with snow, that look really nice. The title of your book, of course, is The Man of the Crowd, which is, of course, the title of one of Poe's stories, and obviously it's a very urban story. So can you talk more about that, about your choice of that title and that rather mysterious story?
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that Poe is in that story. I mean, the story lends the title to the book because, as you said, it's such a thoroughly urban tale. But it also, I think, sheds light on the larger phenomenon of this exponential growth of cities during Poe's lifetime, and the way that I think people were just sort of freaked out by that, by this incredible growth in these places where everybody was a stranger. And I think this was, a period of time when that basic transition from smaller communities to larger urban centers, where the expectation was that you could go all day without necessarily seeing somebody that you know. That's a kind of, I think there's a kind of future shock going on there. And when Poe wrote The Man of the Crowd, he's living in Philadelphia, he sets it in London. So, but I think it's just sort of emblematic of that experience of finding yourself in the anonymous, sprawling city and the fascination that people had with that at the time. So that was really the idea that I was trying to play on in using that story for the title.
I pulled a couple quotes from your book that address sort of the concept of Poe and cities as opposed to outside of cities, outskirts, suburbs, etc. As you know better than, well, just about anyone, Poe lived in a lot of different places throughout his life, and including a lot of different places within cities and near those cities and farther away from those cities. So I'm going to read you a quote, and I'd love for you to elaborate on this one a bit. Poe would be most productive and stable when he was able to live in a rural setting outside the city, and most self-destructive when living in densely populated lower Manhattan.
Well, I mean, and that's sort of why I don't want to equate Poe too much with The Man of the Crowd in the story, because I really don't think Poe thrived in cities. I think that the cities where he lived were an inevitable fact of life for him, and he needed them, and his livelihood and his career were completely dependent on them. So I wanted to get across that Poe's career and his work is inseparable from the rise of the modern city. But on a personal level, I mean, as what you just read suggests, he really wasn't, he was really more comfortable living somewhere on the outskirts, and he did that when he could, both in both when he lived on the Brennan farm in New York, and of course in the Bronx. Right. And to some extent in Philadelphia too. I mean, if he had his druthers, he wouldn't be living right there where all of the magazine offices were and in the most densely populated part of the city.
Right. Yeah. And I guess to clarify, we should say that the Brennan farm that you just referred to right now would be West 84th and Broadway. So that's Upper West Side of Manhattan. But back then, of course, that was country.
Yeah, one of the great ironies, and that was also, I mean, that's I remember standing right there, the street named for Poe on the Upper West Side, and just looking around and thinking, oh my gosh,
right,
this is this wasn't really even New York when Poe was living there. I mean, it was, but it wasn't. I mean, it's literally off the map when you look at contemporary maps of Manhattan.
Right. And then, of course, his move up to the Bronx, which, of course, was the town of Fordham back then, which was nowhere near New York City, really. It was something like, 13 miles away or something?
Right. You had, I mean, the reason it was feasible is that they had recently completed the New York-Harlem Railroad line. So he was living in, kind of, an early railroad suburb. Although, I mean, suburbs a little bit misleading because it was more rural than what we think of as suburbs. But yeah, he was, he didn't think of himself as living in New York City at that point.
Right. Now, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it quite that way, a railroad suburb, although, of course, you qualified correctly. And, of course, Fordham University was there, wasn't it? Didn't he talk to the Jesuit priests and stroll around the fields or something?
Yeah, he did. I mean, and there are, I know that at Fordham, there's a fair amount of lore associated with Poe's time there, but he did. And, pretty reliable sources have him speaking kindly of the Jesuit priests, mainly because they didn't talk about religion too much, and and that they were happy to smoke and drink and talk with him about other matters.
Right. So that kind of relates to another quote, and I pulled these two quotes because this is something I've always been interested in. Noticing that Poe lived, in or near cities, and not being sure which one he preferred. And you say, as much as Poe seems to have preferred living in the semi-rural outskirts, he was very much a city creature, participating in a period of rapid urban development. So I think that really ties into what you were just telling me, that it seems like he personally preferred life outside the city, but was tied to the city and the development professionally. He needed those cities, as you put it. Yeah. So I definitely want to touch on each of the four cities that you go through in the book. Of course, I'm here in Richmond, and I'm personally from Richmond, and this is where the museum is. And so Richmond is Poe's hometown, or we certainly say it is here, at least. Do you think, do you see Poe ultimately as a Richmonder, as a Virginian, as a Southerner, and did he see himself in that way?
That's such a great question. I think that Richmond is the closest thing to a hometown that Poe had, and he grew up there more than he grew up anywhere else. And so that's, I think Richmond's claim to Poe as a native son is very strong. The question, and then, not to mention the fact that he, was back there in 1849 for an extended period, and everything that went on, in his last days. I mean, but as to whether Poe thought of himself as a Southerner, I know there are a lot of people who think of him that way, and that he has been placed in the Southern literary tradition many times in anthologies and in literary histories. So I get that, but I really think Poe was more cosmopolitan in his outlook, and I think that he was willing to adopt whatever city he moved to. So he seems like a diehard Southern literary figure when he's writing for the Southern Literary Messenger and sort of taking on the literati of Gotham. But when he's in New York, he puts on his Yankees cap and he hates the Red Sox, and he's taking on the Boston literary establishment and making jokes about the Frog Pondians. So, I mean, my impression of Poe is that he was going to play for whatever team paid him, and even though nobody paid him well, he could adopt whatever town he was living in.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually, in reading your book, that was the first time I'd really thought of the New York-Boston thing in that way. I knew Poe, of course, had a very complicated relationship with Boston and New England, it seems like, but your book made me think of it in that way. So the stereotypical New York-Boston rivalry, and it sounds like you do think that was really part of it, that Poe, as a adoptive New Yorker, sort of took that on. Would you say that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think he was looking to pick a fight with the Bostonians, and sort of reveled in it. I mean, I don't think it did him much good in the long run. It didn't pay off for him, but that seemed to be his impulse, was to really be to show his New Yorkness by bantering with the Bostonians.
Okay, all right. So Baltimore. Baltimore, of course, gets a lot of Poe-related attention, and I think a lot of it has to do with the people of Baltimore. Have very much claimed Poe. Obviously, they named their NFL team after the Raven. How influential was Baltimore, do you think, in his development as a writer?
I think the main thing is that it was while Poe was living in Baltimore in the early 1830s that he turned to short fiction. And I do think that the sort of traces of the Delphian Club, which had been a Baltimore literary society, sort of gave him the blueprint for his folio club concept, which is how he imagined or framed the collection of his early satirical tales. But I think it's mainly that it was, while he was down and out and living, with the Clems in Baltimore around 1832, that he figured out that there's a market for short fiction, and that I'm really good at it. And so I think the biggest impact that Baltimore had on him, in my opinion, was that's where he kind of found himself career-wise.
Right. Yeah, and then he eventually came down here again, of course, to work for the Southern Literary Messenger. So Philadelphia it seems to be where he wrote perhaps most, or certainly a lot, of his best work. And yet Philadelphia doesn't necessarily get as much attention as Baltimore or even Richmond, maybe, in terms of Poe. So do you have and I've got a few more questions, because you've written some really interesting stuff about Philadelphia, but to start off, do you think there's a particular reason why Philadelphia doesn't get as much Poe-related attention?
Well, around the time of the bicentennial in 2009, they were trying pretty hard, right? I mean, the whole rivalry with Baltimore really became, in a sort of, semi-joking way, kind of heated at that point. I think Poe just really hasn't had, I don't know, in Philadelphia, I don't think he's had the kind of advocates that he had in Baltimore, particularly around the end of the 19th century, with moving the burial marker in Westminster Cemetery, and then in Richmond with the Poe Shrine in the 1920s, and of course what became the Poe Museum. I think that it was really just that civic pride in Baltimore and in Richmond kicked in at the right time and embraced Poe in a way that it just didn't really happen so much in Philadelphia. And it's on the other hand, there's the house. I mean, the fact that there was still a residence where Poe had lived, and Richard Gimbel of the department store fame bought it because it was a Poe fan. Eventually handed it over to the National Park Service. So, I mean, I shouldn't say that Philadelphia ignored Poe. I mean, it is definitely, it's definitely embraced him to that extent. Sure. But I know what you mean. It's not like people think of Poe and they think of Philadelphia. I mean, and not in the way that they do Baltimore or Richmond. Right. And it's a little bit ironic, since, he did write most of his big hits there as far as the short stories go.
Right. Well, I'm certainly not trying to start any fights between cities, but of course, being here at the museum, it's pretty common. People will walk into our museum and say, "Why are you here?" because they associate him with Baltimore, and Philadelphia probably doesn't even get on the radar screens of a lot of people who know Poe casually. So it's something that we at the museum are quite aware of, I guess you could say. Speaking of landlords and such, Jackie Kennedy's great-great-grandfather was Poe's landlord in Philadelphia. I had no idea about that.
Apparently so, and I want to say I drew so much on scholarship that other people had done in writing this book. That was one thing I felt like, okay, I think I've discovered something that nobody else knew.
Well, I certainly didn't know that. And of course, I mentioned it to our 23-year-old marketing director, and she's like, "Who?" Oh, and she's going to listen to this. So you make a really interesting notice of Eastern State Penitentiary, and I'll plug Eastern State Penitentiary. If you haven't been there, go see it. It's quite a place. But Poe, in one of his homes in Philadelphia, he lived right near there, and he wrote some of his very, very best work. And you make some interesting comments about how Eastern State might have actually influenced some of those works, specifically Telltale Heart, Black Cat, Pit and the Pendulum. And I'm going to quote you again. You say Pit and the Pendulum was evocative of the new model prison with its emphasis on isolation and the subjection of prisoners to constant surveillance. I would love if you could elaborate on that a bit more and just tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I mean, I wish that I could make that connection more explicit, because it's so, it's so enticing.
Yeah,
Of course, we don't know that Poe, ever set foot inside Eastern State Penitentiary,
right.
but the coincidence of his having lived so close, and yeah, it is a fascinating place, still open to the public, and it is just about the most Gothic place
Right.
that you can go in the United States, I think. And so it seems so Poe-esque in a way, and especially when you think about that innovation that you just cited, that this was the prison that really pioneered the idea of the hub and spoke design to facilitate the constant surveillance of prisoners, and also isolation, and that, I think, really resonates throughout a story like the Pendulum, where I think you tend to forget this, but a big part of the experience of the prisoner in that story is that he is constantly being watched, and of course isolated as well. So I mean, it's in a very different context, but it is interesting that that kind of correspondence. And then the Black Cat, in the basement of the Poe house in Philadelphia, they have a little stuffed black cat down in the basement, and the basement's really creepy and reminds you of that story. But Poe had already written it by the time he moved there, so it really dates from a little bit earlier, when he would have been living closer to Eastern State Penitentiary. And so the whole confession narrative thing, with the black cat, the telltale heart, yeah, I mean, it's kind of it may just be a coincidence, but I am fascinated by the image of Poe living a couple of blocks from the penitentiary.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of glad you brought that up about the NPS house, because, again, I don't want to pick fights with Philadelphia, but they definitely make a big deal about the black cat in that house. And then I read in your book that he wrote it in the Fairmount house and not the Spring Garden house. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to be sure exactly when certain things were written. I mean, we know exactly when they were published, but yeah, I mean, it definitely dates more likely from that time, and was definitely done before he moved to Spring Garden House.
Mm-hmm, right. So, well, speaking of that sort of, and going back to New York a bit, did he? Are we sure that he finished The Raven in the Brenham farmhouse?
Pretty sure. I mean, in what finished means, I don't know, but clearly it hadn't been published before he moved to New York. He lived in Lower Manhattan briefly before moving to the Brennan farm. It's not like Poe to carry a completed, ready-to-go poem around for that long, because that would have been almost a year that he was just sitting on it. There's good evidence that he had tried to get Graham to publish it in Philadelphia, and that must have been an earlier version of it. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Poe was working on it while he was at Brennan Farm. Whether it was a matter of finishing something he regarded as unfinished, or revising something, or adding to it, I'm not sure. But I think it's I don't think I'm going out on too much of a limb to say that he finished or worked on The Raven before publishing it while he was at Brennan Farm.
Right. Okay. So, but you're saying he might have started it, or had at least an early version of it when he was still in Philadelphia. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Okay. And that's where he met Charles Dickens? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Dickens had a pet raven and wrote about a raven in one of. I'm never quite sure of that story. You could probably tell it better than I could.
So, well, Dickens novel, Barnaby Rudge, has a raven named Grip in it, and yeah, Dickens supposedly had a you know, had a pet raven as well. But Poe, in print, predicted the ending of Barnaby Rudge while it was still being serialized, and that, it really impressed people and even got the attention of Dickens. So when Dickens toured the United States in 1842, Poe managed to set up a meeting with him, and that was kind of a big deal. I mean, Poe at that point, you know, he's well known, but this is pre-Raven, obviously, so he's not the most famous writer in the United States. So to get a meeting with Dickens was kind of a coup, and so yeah, they met. Poe asked Dickens for some help getting his work published in England. And I think Dickens said, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'll do that for you." And then, you know, didn't really do it. But yeah, but
So had Dickens read Poe at that time then?
you know, that's a great question. Someone else might know the answer to that, but I honestly don't. He had read, he must have read Poe's criticism and Poe's comments on him. Whether he had spent time, he probably did, but I'm not positive that, you know, to what extent Dickens had read Poe's fiction or poetry, but it seems likely.
Yeah, yeah. So at this point, Dickens was pretty famous at this point, right?
Enormously famous.
Yeah.
Yeah, the most famous living English writer in the world. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So as we've started to talk about, Poe's last home was in and around New York City, and that is, as we've touched on, where he became famous because of The Raven in 1845. So was that a bad combination? And I guess right now I'm thinking of fame and New York and Poe.
Yeah, it's hard not to think of this in, you know, 21st century terms, but it didn't work out for him. I mean, whether you blame it on New York or blame it on Poe, I don't know. But it's one of those moments in Poe's life where, when you're studying it or when you're reading a biography, you're sort of pulling for him and you're thinking, you know, this time things are going to finally work out for you. You got a hit poem. Everybody wants to invite you to their parties, and you're finally going to be able to do what you want with your magazine. And no, it didn't happen. Poe really kind of began to self-destruct not too long after the success of The Raven, and by the end of the year, it was published the beginning of 1845. By the end of 1845, he is trying desperately to save the Broadway Journal, which he had become a part owner of and then a sole owner of, just as it was going down the drain, and he couldn't rescue it. And he was sort of back to square one by the beginning of 1846. A whole lot of other stuff happened along the way: scandals, his fight with Longfellow and the Bostonians, and also the scandal with Francis Osgood, and with Thomas Dunn English. I mean, so Poe started, it's like his own imp of the perverse kicked in, and throughout 1845, he undermined the success that he had with the popularity of The Raven.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. I think probably in shorthand in my head, I date his severe self-destructive tendencies to after his wife's death, but you make the excellent point. It's not all due to that. It right after he became successful, you're saying, I think.
Yeah, it happens. It happens in late 1845, and then it happens again after Virginia's death. It's kind of a roller coaster ride with Poe. It happened in Philadelphia too. He had sort of hit his stride while he was editing Graham's, after Virginia began showing the signs of tuberculosis, and he then leaves Graham's, um, things go downhill again, and he begins drinking more. And by the time he leaves Philadelphia, I think one of the reasons he left is that is the drinking and the way that he was alienating people in his profession and friends. So yeah, it's sad, but I mean, Poe's career and his life just kind of do that roller coaster ride where you think he's pulling it together, and he thinks he's pulling it together, and tells people, I feel better than I ever have. Quit drinking. I'm doing really well. And then it just doesn't last.
So as far as drinking goes, I tend to tell people he was a binge drinker. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, though I think that's true. Yes. As long as we don't think of binge drinking as having a really good time in the process.
Good point.
So, I kind of think of it like as college binge drinking where, okay, it's unhealthy, but it's a lot of fun while you're doing it. I don't think Poe really ever got a whole lot of pleasure out of drinking. Maybe for a short period of time, he had a little bit of, he had that high, but it is really I think it's probably more accurate to think of it as just self-destructive behavior, where he would turn the corner towards being irascible, antisocial, and just out of it pretty quickly. So binge, yeah, in the sense that he didn't drink every day, he didn't drink at home. These were episodes, but they were serious episodes, and they were not much fun for anybody.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point, a very good clarification. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, I think of The Black Cat, which is at least partially about alcoholism. There's a line in it which is something like, for what disease is like alcohol, or something very close to that. Do you feel that was Poe expressing himself, that he viewed alcoholism as a disease?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting line too, since people didn't typically think of alcohol as a disease in those days in the way that we do today, or alcoholism as a disease rather. They might have thought of it, and Poe might have intended it sort of metaphorically as a disease, but I think part of the problem was that when people remarked on his drinking, I mean, they definitely saw it as a character flaw. There wasn't much sympathy on the part of people like Thomas Dunn English when they mocked Poe for his drinking. They didn't regard it as a disease. So maybe Poe was, through that line, he meant it literally, that this isn't a bad habit. This is a disease.
Right.
But I'm not sure many readers would have taken it that way.
Right. Oh. Let's see. You, of course, live in Charleston, and Charleston was not one of your four cities, which I understand. He didn't spend a lot of time there, but you made...
That's gotten me into a lot of trouble around here, too.
But you made the really interesting point, though, that it was Poe who himself ignored that part of his life. I mean, not just Fort Moultrie, but the 2 years in the Army. And you make a really interesting point. I don't think I'd ever quite thought of it this way, that that part of his life, those 2 years, could be seen as perhaps the most impressive part of his life, because he did very, very well in the Army. He made sergeant major in 2 years, and that includes his time in Sullivan's Island. So why do you think, I'll quote you again, you said, very few people who knew him as Edgar Poe were aware of that chapter in his life. So why do you think he just avoided that, or even lied about it, or ignored it?
I suspect, I mean, I'm really not sure, but I suspect that he regarded it as something that was really unromantic and pedestrian, and sort of, for lack of a better word, low class. That having served in the Army, at that time, I mean, I think he must have felt like, it was saying, you know, I worked on a garbage truck for 2 years or something. I mean, that's, you know,
Yeah,
and I don't mean to insult anybody who works in the sanitation industry, but,
sure.
you know, I think that Poe might have had a feeling that people would regard that as, really, you did that?
Hmm.
Um, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think the fact that he was not an officer, and he didn't serve in battle. So it didn't come with the sort of romantic, dashing profile that he would have liked. Um, so what he substituted for it, you know, was adventures in Europe and Russia,
Right.
um, and a more Byronic version of being a soldier, as opposed to being an enlisted man uh, out at this outpost on a barrier island in South Carolina for a year.
Right.
Um, and again, you know, I say this, but I don't have a real high level of confidence in that answer. But otherwise, I don't know why he would cover it up.
Hmm.
And even if it's really quite right to say he covered it up, but he certainly didn't reveal it. And nobody seems to have known it until George Woodbury in the 1880s uncovered the information for his biography.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I really realized that he covered that up in that much until I read your book. Now, of course, this is purely speculative, but he went to West Point and got himself kicked out after a few months. Do you think if he had been successful there and actually served as an officer for a few years, that he would have covered that up as well?
No, I think, you know, if my half-baked thesis is correct, I think he liked that West Point cast a better image.
Yeah.
And the fact that he reconciled temporarily with John Allen in an effort to get into West Point, I think he was encouraged to believe that this reconciliation would lead to an inheritance,
Uh,
and that he would be a sort of gentlemanly military man, an officer, and just a different kind of person in the world. Because this was before he started writing short stories. I mean, he was still a poet, and he could have been a sort of gentleman who also wrote poetry on the side, and I think that would have been fine. So, yeah, I think if he hadn't had the falling out with Allen, if he hadn't gotten court-martialed from West Point, world literature would be much poorer for it. But Poe would have been happy with that outcome at the time.
yeah. So, of course, later on, he used Sullivan's Island as the setting for one of his more interesting stories, The Gold Bug. As someone who is presumably familiar with the area, do you think that he got it right? Do you think he was deeply inspired by it, or did he just sort of put it there for? I'm not even entirely sure what I'm asking here, except that you live in Charleston, and what do you think about the gold bug? I guess.
Well, I love the gold bug, but I don't think Poe was very attentive to detail in terms of his description of the terrain.
Okay.
And I don't think it mattered to him. I mean,
Hmm.
he needed what he needed for that story. Um, he didn't, he didn't need sort of regional detail for the gold bug to be successful.
Hmm.
So he wrote it about 15 years after he had been stationed at Fort Moultrie. Um, so it made enough of an impression on him that he wanted to use it. But I also think after 15 years, he probably didn't remember the details of the terrain particularly well, or if he did, he was going to change it so that there could be high ground for a tree that could be pivotal to the whole exploration that leads to the discovery of the treasure. So I think he did. Yeah, he did with it what he wanted. But it is interesting. I mean, and I tell people around here, especially, that Charleston and Sullivan's Island have a unique claim to fame, because I mean, I know that we've got the Tale of the Ragged Mountains, and in the area around Charlottesville as well, but it's the most, it's a story that's thoroughly set in this place, and I don't think there's another story by Poe in an American setting that makes as much use of that setting as Poe does with the Goldbug and Sullivan's Island. And then, of course, he uses it again as the dateline for the balloon hoax, the transatlantic balloon voyage that he makes up. It ends at Sullivan's Island.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten that. Okay. All right. So I did want to ask you now. Maybe I should mention that this interview is being recorded on October 30th, 2020. So politics is in the air right now, and we're going to stay in the 19th century. But I did want to, yeah. You write that Poe sought a position as a clerk in the Van Buren administration in 1838. I don't think I knew that. You said that Poe's sympathies generally resided on the Whig side, meaning John Tyler and William Henry Harrison. And then Poe later, of course, tried to get a job in the Tyler administration. So I'm going to ask you, how political was he, but also how much did this have to do with his identity, like what we were talking about at the beginning of the interview, how he saw himself in terms of the cities and regions? Or was he just trying to get a sinecure so he could just write?
Basically, I think it's the latter. I think he was just looking for a government job. I think I wouldn't say Poe was apolitical, but he was not political in the way that, say, Walt Whitman was as a Free Soil Democrat in the 1850s, writing for Democratic papers. Or even Hawthorne with his allegiance to the Democratic Party because of Franklin Pierce. Poe inevitably got caught up in politics, and it is, I think, perfectly reasonable to read a number of his stories with the politics of the time in mind. But as far as having an allegiance to a particular political party for any length of time, I just don't see it. I don't think it was at the forefront of his mind. I think he was too busy trying to figure out how he was going to start his own magazine or how he was going to make rent the next month.
Right. Well, this has been a fascinating interview, and again, I love the book, and I am looking forward to recommending it to people who come to the museum and ask me about which biography to purchase. So I'd like to close with one or two things. First of all, I want to ask you something that we get asked here all the time, and you probably get asked all the time too, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. Do you have a particular favorite or favorites among Poe's stories or poems?
Well, I got to say, right now, my favorite is The Man of the Crowd.
Sure.
It sort of has to be. But I mean, seriously, I really do love that story. And I like to teach that story partly because it's not what students are expecting. It sort of is because it's mysterious and dark, but it isn't because you're waiting for something to happen that doesn't really happen. And so it's this strangely modern story, and this whole idea, of one man following another man through the streets from dusk till dawn. I just think it's a really cool motif, and so I really do like the story. But that's got to be my answer right now, since I borrowed the title for the book.
Well, that makes sense, and that is indeed a very interesting story. It's not as well known as maybe it should be. And once again, Scott's book is The Man of the Crowd. I think we'll probably get some better graphics here later on, but The Man of the Crowd is right here. It has been published. It's in stores now. And just want to thank you very much, Scott, for joining me today.
Thanks, Dean. I really appreciate it. And before we end the talk, I just want to say how much I appreciate the Poe Museum in general. I mean, it's the best resource for Poe materials that's available to the public. And when Michelle and I were working on the book and came through Richmond, Chris Sempner was enormously helpful to us. And the museum was kind of like a home base for us in Richmond. And I just can't thank you on behalf of the museum enough for the support that I got in working on the book.
Well, we definitely appreciate it, and I'll certainly pass that on to Chris. For our audience, I'm sure some of our audience knows, Chris Sentner has been the curator here for over 20 years, and he knows more about Poe than almost anyone in the world, quite literally. So he is an amazing resource here. And so, yeah, we are here at the Poe Museum, 1914 East Main Street in Shockoe Bottom, Richmond, Virginia. We've been open since 1922, so almost 100 years. And we are currently open now during COVID. So we hope you come see us and buy Scott's book. It's really a very good book. And thank you all for joining us.